Great. Well, welcome everyone. Despite the fact that we're not all gathered together in one location as we usually are for our lunch talks, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge that our building and Brown University sit on occupied Indigenous lands, specifically the traditional homelands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples. We note too that our campus drew its early life's blood from the African slave trade in the Americas, and there are buildings on Brown's campus constructed by enslaved people. These acknowledgements commit us as a community to a lifetime of unsettling anti-racist work. I'm Marissa Brown, Assistant Director for Programs at the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage. Welcome to our ongoing lunch talk series, Public Humanities Now, New Voices, New Directions. We are virtual now. We will be for the remainder of the semester. So pleased to have people join and hear from Margaret Middleton, who I will introduce right now. Margaret Middleton is a Providence-based independent exhibit designer and museum consultant working at the intersection of design and social justice. Middleton holds a degree in industrial design from RISD and is the creator of the Family Inclusive Language Guide. Their writing has appeared in the Journal of Museum Education, the Association of Science and Technology Centers magazine Dimensions, and the National Association for Museum Exhibitions journal Exhibition. They have been an exhibition designer at Boston Children's Museum and the Children's Discovery Museum of San Jose. Current clients include Connecticut Landmarks, the Maine Historical Society, and Fairfield Museum and History Center of Connecticut. Finally, Margaret moves to Belfast this summer. Still true, I think, Margaret, yes?
Hopefully.
Okay. So when we first talked about doing this lunch talk, that seemed like a thing, but now that we all live in a Zoom universe, we can continue to connect with you even after you move to Belfast. Thank you so much for being here in this virtual space, sharing your work, sharing your thoughts about exhibition design and inclusivity. And just a note about questions. So the way that Margaret will do their presentation, and I'm going to use the chat box for questions. So you'll see that no one has access to the microphone right now, which is sort of in line with best practices for protecting these talks. But feel free to use your chat box so that you can let me know if you have a question for Margaret. I will chat back with you to let you know where you are in the lineup. And once we get to you, I can unmute you so you can ask your question yourself. So without further ado, Margaret, I will take off the introductory slides so you can share your slides with us. I'm pleased to have everyone here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Thanks everybody for being here. Rolling with it. That was an extremely thorough introduction. I feel like I can just jump right in. So thank you. I will start my slides here. So this is some contact information for me. So if you want to get in touch, these are the best ways to get in touch with me. I am an independent exhibit designer and museum consultant. And what that means for me is that I work out of a home office, and most of my work is done remotely and digitally and over the phone. I do a lot of phone calls. And and so that's what I've been doing for the last 4 years. I'm going to try to advance my slides here. There we go. Here's three different things that three different ways that I see my current career. exhibition design, really like when I say that, I'm really talking about the physical layout of a space, the graphic design of the panels in that exhibit, and specifications for any custom builds that are happening. So it's very like physical. This is, these are plans that I'm making. I'm also a museum consultant. I do inclusion consulting specifically around family inclusion. Like Marissa said, I developed a tool called the Family Inclusive Language Chart, which is used in museums for using language as a tool of inclusion, specifically for families of a variety of different makeups, including queer families, and that's something that's important to me personally. So it's become part of my practice, and through that, there's been interest in from museums in hiring me to talk about creating more family inclusive learning spaces. Thirdly, I do like to write, and I guess what I'll say here, because this is a question that I get often from folks who are entering the museum field, is how I'm incorporating the values that I like to speak and write about into my design work. And I will say that it is very challenging in my role as an exhibition designer, specifically as an exhibition designer who's working on a contract basis. So I'm not located in a museum anymore. And what that means is that I like that because I get to work very quickly. And I'm opening many exhibits in 1 year, whereas when I was in-house in an institution, I was only opening an exhibit maybe once a year, once every other year. So I like the pace of it, but what it does mean is that I have a lot less influence over the content of the exhibitions that I'm working on. I'm really working in this in a pretty technical capacity. So I have a lot of ideas about how I would love to marry those values and the practice that I'm doing as a designer. And I think that they are absolutely applicable to that work. That's not something that I get to do all that often. So I'm hoping that in this quick talk today that we can kind of like talk about maybe this as like the aspirational level, and then maybe a little bit about the reality and thinking about like how those two things could maybe come closer together, because I would call myself an idealist. I definitely see the opportunity there. But in practice, there's some limitations that are totally overcomable. So this is a quote that you've probably seen many times now, but I do go back to it because I really, this is like a grounding principle for me in my work, the idea of museums being for people. Sure, they can be about things, and that's maybe those are some of the main goals of them from a long time ago. But the way I approach my work is through visitor experience and thinking closely about like who is going to be in that space and how do they feel and are they going to have a good time. So a couple of things that I was thinking about as I was putting these slides together: the purpose of the museum, who the museum is for, what do visitors want, and what do visitors need. So those are some things that I'm coming at every project. Every project that I begin, these are some of those grounding questions that I have for myself. So I really like to foreground my, when I talk about like where I'm coming from in my perspective, I really like to to make a point of the fact that the in-house work that I have done is exclusively within children's museums. And I say this because I think it's just as much a part of my practice as is my background in industrial design. Because in a children's museum, the thing that I love the most about children's museums, and I love everything about children's museums, but one of the most exciting things I think about a children's museum is it actually has the visitor in the name of the museum. It's not what it's about or what are you going to see when you go into that museum. It's all about you, children. It's a museum for children. So that, as you can imagine, that's what colors every experience that we're creating in that museum. It's all about people. So these are the 3 children's museums that I've had the pleasure of working for. And since then, I've been able to have children's museums as clients. But for the most part, I work for history museums, which is a completely new and exciting thing for me to learn about. Learning curve's pretty steep, actually. I have a huge amount of respect for the work that historians do. And I love the fact that people are approaching me to do the hope, I think, that they're hiring me with is that maybe we can incorporate some of these super visitor focused elements that children's museums naturally do, and bring them to maybe a more traditional, what I consider a grown-up museum. So some of those basic needs that go into any experience that are always at the forefront of a children's museum experience, but may not necessarily be at the forefront of the considerations for a grown-up museum would be comfort, safety and accessibility, and enjoyment. Comfort. This is, well, I was going to say it's one of my favorites, but I kind of love all of these. This one I think is easy because it's about like what would you want in your home, you know? Like you want a place to sit down. We talk about that all the time, I think, and it sounds so simple, but how many times have you been to a museum exhibit and there wasn't a place to sit down, right? Like that's actually a lot of museum experiences actually don't incorporate seating, even though it's so basic, even though it's like something we talk about all the time. Still doesn't happen. It gets like, maybe it's like on the purchase list and maybe it gets, we call it value engineered out, right? It's not a priority. So it's a huge priority in the space that I design. And you can see I've got a variety of different, I like to do themed seating. It's a great way to set a scene and kind of carry through a look and feel. In the case of this exhibit here is an exhibit called Rising Tides. And I'm just going to give you like I don't know, Marissa, if you want to like, let me know if I'm like going a little too long on anything here. We've got these 3 topics. Oh, I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. I was just saying, yeah, I'm happy to, so you don't have to look at the clock. So I'll just kind of I'll give you a, a little.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
No problem.
It would be very easy for me to go too long. So thank you for that. I'll just point out one of the exhibits shown here. This one over here on the left is from an exhibit called Rising Tides, which I did for Fairfield Historical Society in Fairfield, Connecticut. And so it's all about climate change. And one of the reasons why, this is a 2-parter. And the first half of the museum exhibit experience was about the history of the coast and people living on the coast. And this was a way to ground what is a contemporary story in history, so it would align with the museum's mission, but it was also this great way to remind people of why they value living on the coast. Most of their visitors are local, and it was our way of helping us talk about value, like our personal values and our nostalgia for life along the coast. One of the ways that we got into that was using these great beach chairs, which we found on eBay. They are, so I would say that this is, chairs can be tricky when it comes to accessibility. Not every chair is going to work for every person. These particular ones aren't going to work for someone who's very large, and they're not going to work for the slingback one here, especially does not work for somebody with bad knees. They both have armrests, which is great because that can help somebody get in and out of a chair. But those are all things to be thinking about. These aren't necessarily the most accessible. I would say beanbag chairs get used a lot in spaces that are meant to be like comfy, and those are some of the least accessible forms of seating that you can possibly have. So something with a back, something with armrests tend to be better. Of course, like having anything that moves like a hammock or a slingback chair is going to be more challenging too. But anyway, just to put it out there, we were using these as a way to affect visitors. Like we were using affect, and we were also using, so these are actually like, we could consider them objects. They are like from the time period that we were talking about. But they're also, they're also usable. These are items that we got on eBay. So they can have these, the comfort piece can serve a lot of different jobs. And of course, seating is only one piece of comfort, but this is one example. So safety and accessibility. I think one of the first things that comes up when we talk about accessibility is wheelchair accessibility. And that often gets relegated to being thought about as just a path through, which is pretty boring. If all you're able to do in an exhibit is be able to pass through the exhibit. So that's only one piece of it. That's only one piece of access, this pathway. Heights of objects and text is a big piece because this hits at a lot of different things. It could be the height of a person, it could be the height of, and like a lot of different things will affect your height. It could be like your physical height, it can also be the way that you're seated, it could be how old you are. So same with light levels. So light levels is a tricky one, I would say, because what's good for some folks is going to be like really bad for other folks. Bright light can be really, really challenging for people with light sensitivity, whereas dim lighting can be really hard for people with low vision. I think it's anytime that I get to actually play with light in the space, which is very rare. Usually the galleries that I'm invited into, unless we're building them from scratch, they have a set lighting grid, and there's not a lot that I can do as an exhibit designer coming in from the outside. I don't usually get to play with that. If we are building the exhibit from scratch, most LEDs are actually dimmable these days. And so you can set up a whole lighting grid with LED pucks that are dimmable. And that way you can actually adjust for the visitor rather than trying to say like, this is a standard that everyone should conform to. One thing I do think though that is easy, and this comes from children's museums very specifically for me, is the copy size and contrast. most of my clients will be very surprised when I give them a graphic standard package that will show them. I say, please print this out, please look at it, you know, like before we approve, because it's going to look bigger to you than you're used to. I never make an object label that is smaller than what is considered large print, which is large print is 16 to 18 point size font. And if you're familiar with regular copy, like a printed, like if you're like writing a letter, like letter size paper, 12 point is the standard. So it's significantly larger than the type that's used in exhibits, which is for object labels, not infrequent that it's actually smaller than 12 point. So that's an easy one, I think, is to just simply boost that copy size in an exhibit. It makes a huge difference. It also tends to force whomever is writing a label to make it a little bit shorter, which is always a good thing. And last but not least, multisensory interpretation. I think I have a slide for that. Yeah, so here are a couple of more examples from that Rising Tides exhibition. I'm trying to use that one as a case study because I feel like we did a lot of good things with that exhibit that I don't normally even get to. A lot of times we're limited by the budget or the time frame or something like that. And this one we had a little bit more time and a little bit more budget than usual. That said, these two are really, really cheap things that we did. This item over here on the left is a 3D printed view of the coast. And what it is it's tactile. And you can feel like you can feel the elevation of the topography close to the coast of Fairfield, Connecticut. It includes Fairfield and Bridgeport because we were making some comparisons and contrasts between those two cities and the planning that both of the cities had put into, you know, how they're thinking about like responding to rising sea level. And this is the really super low tech. So, okay, so 3D printing sounds maybe like that would cost us an arm and a leg, but we actually went to the local college and they did it for us for free. And they used it as a project. Like it was something that the students were getting credit for, which is cool. And so we have this like really, and this is all free data, you know, this is all like GIS data that you can just download for free. It's Google Maps. Yeah, and then so what I was able to do then is I hung a projector from a funky angle by Velcro from the ceiling. And that was something that I was able to just do with like large strips of Velcro. And I put together a PowerPoint because I am not a video editor, but I was able to create a PowerPoint and export it as a video, and it just loops. It goes through like several different years of sea level change and storm surges. And so it goes back and forth between those things. So there's no like, it's not interactive that way, and in that you don't choose what you're looking at. You're just simply seeing this projected on top of the map. Anyway, it was super successful and extremely low tech. And this piece over here on the right, these are a bunch of taxidermy birds that the museum just borrowed from the local Audubon Society. Everybody's got some extra stuffed birds, so took advantage of that. And I collected a bunch of this stuff at the feet of these birds. Some of that's fake from Michael's, you know. But a lot of that is like real stuff that I pulled off of the beach just right down the road from the museum. So it actually had this like great seaside smell to it from some of that like seaweed and, you know, mermaids' purses and things like that I picked up on the beach. So that was almost completely free. We did buy the sand though, because we wanted it to be clean. So it's clean sand. But yeah, it's just a tray full of sand with some beach stuff on it and some free birds that we borrowed. And it became like a cool I Spy thing. We had these are like the pictures of the birds here. And you could find them. We added a couple around the exhibit, so some of them were more challenging to find and identify. And then it had that smell component, which is, as I'm sure you all know, that's one of those great memory recall senses that we have that will create memory and also like bring it right back. And then this is my last slide here, enjoyment. So all children's museum exhibits are required to be fun. That's the point. And that's grounded in experience with children, but it's also grounded in brain science, that play is the way that children learn, and that fun is the way that you get to prolonged engagement. And prolonged engagement is really where a lot of that really exciting learning is happening. And so I would argue that doesn't really go away for people, that we're all children who are a little bit older now. And so having a fun experience in a museum is not specific to children or families, and that it's something that everybody can benefit from. So I've just got a couple of examples. This is actually my most recent exhibit over here on the left. This is a 19th Amendment exhibit that I did for Staten Island Museum. And we did a couple of things that were kind of fun. I didn't actually get to visit this exhibit because it's in New York City, and they were the first to shut down. And so this was only open for a week before it was closed to the public. I didn't get a chance to see it. So if I were the one taking the pictures, I would have taken a nice big shot of this thing that's behind this guy here. And what it is it's a suffragist personality quiz, and it's a dichotomous key, and you just follow with your finger. It's just a sign, but you can follow it and choose a few different personality traits of your own, and it will match you up with a type of organizer from the suffrage movement, which I think was kind of fun. And it was a way to help people make a personal connection with the folks in the exhibit. And yeah, and it's also a way to like show that the suffrage movement has a lot in common with contemporary social justice movements. At this table where this little kid is sitting, they are doing a pennant making activity. So that's like the triangular like Votes for Women flag, and they can write whatever they want on it. So they've got his paper, and then there's actually a place for them to put them up and display them if they want to leave them behind in the exhibition. This thing right here in the center is from Rising Tides again. This is a photo op, and it is about clam digging. So you can put on a pair of hip waders. We've got all sorts of like fun costume stuff. It's all, I think it's all grown-up sized, actually. They have very few child visitors at the Historical Society. This got a lot of use when it was up. This is a temporary exhibition. All three of these are temporary exhibitions. That was our hidden osprey up here. Like if you had good eyes, you would have found this in the I Spy. And this lastly over here, this is I want to do a little shout out for this museum. This is the Living Computer Museum in Seattle. And something I really love about this museum is that it's a history museum, but almost all of their collection is working. And when they have it out on the floor, you can actually interact with it. So not everything, but most of the things that they have, like most of the computers that they have in their collection, they actually have out for people to use. And this is like a, I don't know, like a 93 compact computer or something. No, I can't tell what it is. I'm not good at computers. This is this is from the 90s. It's from the early 90s. And this was actually like a game in this exhibit that we did about Barbie and computers. It was called Barbie Gets at the Program. And it was all of these sort of Barbie sets that we paired with computers, the real computers that her like little doll-sized computers were based on. So she had one of these in her bedroom setup, and we played a game about, one of the first, I think it was the first computer game, Fashion Designer Barbie. It was Barbie's first computer game that you could, it was actually very cool. You could like print out clothes for her and then put them on her. Like you could like fold it and then put it on her. You could actually make doll clothes with it. Very cool. But we actually set it up and people were able to use it. And I guess I really like that spirit. They have very old computers that you can use there, but this is, I like the idea of maybe like a sacrificial feels like the wrong word, but an education object that's a collection object, but it's also something that the visitors can use. It's not being very precious about the objects, and I like that a lot because, I think that more history museums could adopt this kind of spirit. Anyway, there's a bit of a whirlwind there, but those are my three tenets of things that I like to think about in thinking about visitor experience in museums. So let's talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Margaret. So questions are streaming in on the chat box, and Susan has the first question.
So these are great, such interesting projects, Margaret. I wondered who you were working with now.
Right now, so sorry, I'm just trying to figure out how to unshare. Can I unshare?
Oh yeah, I can probably do that. There, I can do that right now. You want me to?
Oh, there we got it.
Okay.
Okay. So I am working with Heritage Museum and Gardens in Sandwich, Mass. And I'm working with Connecticut Landmarks, which is based in Hartford, Connecticut.
Could you tell me what the projects are?
Oh, sure, yeah. So for Heritage, this one's really fun. I really hope that we're able to open it someday. It's about toy history specific to New England. And yeah, there's a ton of toy manufacturing history here. And yeah, it's mostly about the manufacturing history. And they have a great collection of cast iron toys, like mechanical banks and things like that. So that's kind of the basis for it, but they're doing a massive loan project. Like they've got loans from all over New England and New York State too. The Strong Museum has an incredible toy collection. So yeah, like that one's a lot of fun. And then Connecticut Landmarks, gosh, we've got 4 different historic houses that we're working on there. Which it's the Phelps Hathaway House in Suffield, the Hempstead houses in New London, the Butler McCook House in Hartford, and the Nathan Hale Homestead in Coventry. Yeah, learning a lot about Connecticut geography.
And are you designing exhibits in each of those places, in each of the different houses?
Yeah. So they don't currently have exhibitions or exhibition space. And we're doing something a little different in each of the houses. Some of them have room for more traditional exhibits and some of them don't. Like for example, in Hempstead, most of that house is not, like a lot of the furniture in that house is not original. So it wasn't a huge lift to say, let's just clear out one bedroom and do a more traditional exhibit. And what I mean by that is, I mean like graphic panels. Like that's when I say like a traditional exhibit, I'm talking about graphic panels, because that for that particular historic house, we just don't have objects. So it's a discussion space, like a feedback area, and some graphic panels about the history of the abolition movement in Connecticut.
Okay, sorry, that was just another question coming in. Kate, I think you have the second series of questions.
Hi, thank you very much. So I have two questions. One is, how does your approach change when you're designing a temporary exhibit versus a permanent one? And then the second question is, how do you think the current public health crisis and the idea of COVID might impact the sort of interactive and high touch exhibit design spaces? What should we be sort of thinking about on the sort of museum end of things about how to keep people engaged when sort of multi-touch spaces might be of concern?
Yeah, great. Okay, I'll start with your first question, temporary versus permanent. I guess I would say that something about a temporary exhibit that would be a little different than a permanent one is that, well, we're generally looking at a different budget usually, and we're looking at like not a lot of infrastructure changes. So for a temporary exhibit, I'm likely working from a set of existing casework and sometimes even existing wall systems. Sometimes I don't even get to paint those. And by paint them, I mean specify that they will be painted. I don't tend to usually do the installation work personally. Sometimes I do get to do that, but not often. So those are like the main differences. And I sometimes also, like with a temporary exhibit, will have a very specific audience in mind. And like for example, with Heritage Museum and Gardens, I think they would consider themselves like a very family-friendly museum. I don't know if you've had the pleasure of going there, but it's a very cool place. They've got like a bunch of old cars, and then they've got like a beautiful carousel, and they've got these gardens with sculptures and plantings. So a little bit of everything. But that said, I don't think they usually think of their exhibitions as being particularly kid-friendly, and that was something that was important to them this time around with the toy exhibit. So you can kind of, sometimes you get to take like a little bit of a departure when it comes to primary audience who's being prioritized in that space. And for a permanent exhibit, those are where we're building in some of those ability to change, like when I was talking about like light levels and things like that, like being able to build in ways to make sure that it actually works for a whole variety of folks. I see that as like the biggest luxury of a permanent exhibit plan. With the public health thing, I do think that like traditional museums can probably take a cue. Children's museums in this way. Children's museums have been bleaching the living daylights out of everything since time began. So I do think that learning how to upkeep interactives and higher touch exhibitions. Like all of that work has been done by children's museums for a long time. So looking to them as the leaders there, I think is probably a good idea. I don't think that we're ever going to see a time when tactile exhibits aren't best practice. And I would say that because that's what cognitive neuroscience tells us. Like that's what learning research tells us, is that the more senses that are involved in the learning, the better it is. I think people go to museums because they're physical spaces. I don't think that the digital version of it is a replacement at all. So I don't think we're going to see that. I think we're always going to seek out these spaces that are destinations, and they're social experiences that we can have with people. And I know that that's not available to us right now, but it will be someday in the future. And so I guess I would say that like, it'll be more about, I think our priority should be more about like how to have people have like healthy and safe interactions in the museum, rather than saying you can't have any interactions in the museum. Do you know what I'm saying?
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Okay, let me just see. I know the next person who had a question was one of our students, Sharon. Let me just find her so I can unmute her microphone, which I think is ready to go. Sharon, if you've got your question. I feel like I'm hosting a radio show. Yeah. This is exciting.
Yes.
Next caller, please.
This is so fun. Thank you for sharing your work with us, Margaret. I have a question. It's sort of related to, and oftentimes I'm enjoying the kids sections in museums the most, actually, because they're usually more colorful and less stressful, in a sense that I feel like once since the visitors are older, you need to have a better knowledge of the topic that's on exhibit, but that's usually not the case. So I was wondering, in the exhibit design circle, is there a discussion about how to get more senses involved in each exhibit design that are usually targeted for kids? Like, I feel like adults could also benefit so much from the suffrage exhibit. So I was wondering, is there a tendency and this discussion of there's no need to be stressful about that, since you're we don't involve play or quizzes or other fun stuff on site, and what are your thoughts? Thank you.
Great. Thanks. It was breaking up a little bit. I just want to make sure that I got your question right. It sounded like you were talking about that sometimes there's like a kid section, and then there's like the stuff for grown-ups, and how can we integrate those a little better?
Yeah, sort of. Like, I feel like no matter how old the target audience is, they would all benefit so much from more interaction and more senses involved in an exhibit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think, I mean, I guess I don't think that there are any changes necessarily that you know, things that, so I guess I would say, I guess I'll back up and say, I do think that sometimes like the kids section in a history museum does tend to be like, here's a themed play space, which is very different than saying here is like a content informed experience that you can have that's more bodily and more sensory. So I guess I would love it. I would love to see kids sections actually in these spaces be more like to, if we were to take like a children's museum ethos to a kids section in a history museum, it would be less like come play on a covered wagon shaped play space, and it would be more about like you know, more thoughtful, like how can we like use our bodies and talking through the content. And I do think that like once we begin approaching those experiences from that lens rather than the themed playset lens, then we will be ready to approach grown-up spaces from that like really like whole body, whole social, like the social aspect of learning, like all of those things, like I think would come very naturally then if we're kind of approaching it that way. Because I think really when it comes down to it, like the approach is very much the same. That I think like some of the things that I get really excited about, but I try not to lean too hard on, is when designing experiences for grownups, we generally can assume that people are okay with doing some reading, and that's within their ability range. So I think that if you come at exhibition design from the idea that like, well, okay, like what's your experience if you're not reading at all? What's your experience if you're just reading a little bit? And then what's your experience if you're reading a lot? So like coming at it from this like layered approach where it like, this should work if, you know, you're not doing a lot of reading, you're mostly just sort of like moving through the space, and like, what are you getting out of moving through the space? I don't know if that was a little rambly. Am I getting at all what you're asking about?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry about that. Wait.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I was muted. Yeah, thank you for answering the question.
Okay, great. I think, yeah, Susan had another question.
I was just hoping, Margaret, you could talk a little bit more about what you meant about inclusivity when you talk about inclusive design, and where we might see that in the work you've talked about.
Yeah, so inclusion is one of those buzzwords that gets used a lot. When I think about inclusion, I'm thinking about like more specifically in the way that I'm designing. Thinking about ability, I'm thinking about age. And
right. I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit more about the inclusive family stuff you've done.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the family inclusive language is really based on the idea of using language to welcome families that are like beyond that, like little, you know, like that little like family icon you see, which is like a little man stick figure, a little woman stick figure, and in between them is like a little like smaller man, and they're all holding hands. Like that's, I think that because that gets used as this default, like that's like, if that's our default family, that's who we're expecting to come in the door, then there are a lot of assumptions that go along with that. And so the family inclusive language chart is really just about like, so, okay, I'll back up and I'll say, when I was in-house in a museum, I wasn't like a manager of anything. I wasn't in charge of anything. I had the title exhibit designer, but I didn't have a lot of authority in the museum. So, but I also like have a lot of thoughts about how museums could be better. And that comes a lot from my industrial design training, which is about identifying problems and seeking solutions. So because I approach things with that mindset, that's how I'm thinking about things, but I'm also in a place where I have very little, relatively what I saw as very little power within the institution, formal power, I guess I would say. But I realized there were some things that I did have control over. And that tends to be like some of the ways that I approach the writing and inclusion work that I'm doing is like, what are some quick free things that we can do to make change we don't have to ask permission for? It's not going to get bogged down in some bureaucracy or red tape or concerns about board members or what have you, and all this nonsense that ends up entering the decision-making process. So one of those things is language. And there's this great, there's actually a really great TED Talk. I can send like a link, I guess, out to everybody who, I like this. It's a Dr. Lyra Boroditsky. She's a cognitive neuroscience scientist, I believe. And she talks about the way that language actually changes the way that you think. So you actually have the power to change the way that you're thinking by choosing language. And so that's sort of the basis behind the idea of starting with language, because it's something that you can do on an individual basis. And you don't have to ask anybody permission to use more inclusive language, and you don't need to have, it's not a line item in a budget. So what the chart does is it lays out 5 or 6 different words or phrases to avoid, suggestions for alternative phrases or words, and a quick explanation of why.
Can you send us the chart? That sounds really
Absolutely.
useful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, great. I think I found it online, Margaret.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Around to everyone. You said Lyra Boroditsky?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Great. I have one other question. Where do you see the most interesting work in the field being done? I mean, whether you're seeing that in specific institutions or a specific kind of work. I mean, what are you most excited about when you look at the field and kind of nubs of things that are growing that you're excited to see develop more fully over the next, 5 or 10 years?
Oh, what a good question. I guess I am I'll say like 2 institutions maybe that I am like a bit of a fan kid for. One of them is the Pittsburgh Children's Museum. And I think one of the reasons why that is such an inspiration to me is that I really like the way that they think about feelings. I think that there are maybe like a lot of children's museum conventions that tend to be all about content, and I really like that. I guess I would say that like that's kind of the way that many children's museum exhibits can often play out. But I would argue that a lot of the theory is actually about attitudinal outcomes, and that's actually really what we're going for. Like in a best practice ideal case sort of place is that the goal of a children's museum exhibit is really much more about like getting a good feeling about science, or feeling like it's personally relevant to me rather than this is what gravity is. So I think those are really big differences. I would argue that like those are the some of the more like memorable or foundational or inspirational exhibits that I've visited personally have been much more about some sort of attitudinal shift that I got. And so, Pittsburgh Children's Museum has done exhibits about love and forgiveness, right? Like, I just think that's beautiful. I think that's really incredible. And it makes me really happy that a children's museum is thinking about it, because I really think that that's taking that theory right into practice. And I really think that they live their values like that really well. Another institutional inspiration for me is the Peabody Essex Museum. I really like what they're doing with multisensory experiences in their exhibits, and the way that they're using that to be more accessible for people of a whole variety of abilities. Yeah, I think like most recently, the way that they've redone their permanent galleries like the Maritime Gallery and I think the Maritime Gallery I think is actually, and the Asian Export Gallery. Those two I think are really well done. And I really, yeah, they have, they're doing some really creative things there.
Thank you. Thanks so much for this talk. It's great for so many of us who are in public humanities but don't come from a background of industrial design or exhibition design to constantly be hearing from people in your field, just because when we think about doing exhibitions, we sort of start with content always. So it's great to just always be keeping in mind all of the things that are top of mind for you. So thanks for sharing, and thanks for your work.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
Thank you. Okay, everyone, before I let you go, I'll just remind you our next virtual lunch talk will be April 28th, and that will be 12 to 1, of course. Amelia Grabowski, who got her MA from our department in 2015, and her talk is called Crafting the Mini Exhibit in Your News Feed, a behind-the-scenes look at museum social media management. So hope to see everyone there, if not before then, on some other virtual lunch talk via Zoom. And Margaret, good luck with everything. Good luck with your move, and we hope to stay in touch with you too. So thanks for doing this.
Thanks so much.
All right. Bye, everyone.